It was December 12, 1944. Winter had arrived early that year. Across the plains of the American Midwest, the fields were frozen solid, the earth sealed tight by a deep frost. The cornstalks, now gray and brittle, rattled like skeletons whenever the wind swept over the open prairie. That morning, the sun struggled to break through a thin veil of low-hanging clouds. The silence was broken not by the usual drone of tractors or the talk of farmhands, but by the sharp scrape of boots on frozen ground and the faint clinking of chains. A column of German prisoners of war was marching toward the farm. They walked in a guarded line, wearing wool coats from the U.S. Army that were patched with pieces of their old uniforms. A few still wore caps with faded insignia, though most had given up any pride in such symbols long ago. Their breath formed white plumes in the air as they trudged forward, their eyes on the ground and their shoulders hunched against the biting cold. Some were barely 20 years old. Others bore the deep exhaustion of men in their 30s, men who had seen too much of a war that had long ago lost its promise of glory. With every step, they carried a burden heavier than the winter frost. It was the weight of propaganda, the stories they had been told about how Americans would hate them, how they would be destroyed. For years, the German High Command had fed them a vision of the United States as a cruel nation. They were told of factories run by their enemies, of civilians who would spit on them and leave them to starve. Many of these men believed those stories. They expected to be beaten, maybe even shot, if they slowed down in their work. This fear was a constant companion, tangled with the hunger that gnawed at their insides. The food on the ships that brought them across the Atlantic had been scarce, and the long train rides across the vast American landscape offered little more. As they arrived at this snow-covered farm, they prepared themselves for more of the same. A woman was waiting for them. She stood at the edge of the yard, a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her hands flushed red from the cold. She was in her 40s. Her husband was overseas with the infantry, leaving her and her eldest son just the snow. But she did not smile. Her jaw was firm, her eyes unwavering. She understood that mercy was not weakness, but it was not softness either. The guard escorting them issued sharp commands. The prisoners were to work in the fields. They were forbidden from entering the house. They were not to go near the barn without permission. The woman listened and nodded. But as the soldier laid out the rules, the wind changed direction, and it carried a new scent from her kitchen. It was the smell of cornbread baking in the oven, beans simmering on the stove, and apple preserves warming near the fire. That smell drifted across the yard, a silent act of defiance against the cold machinery of war. The Germans lifted their heads, their expressions shifting. For a brief moment, their eyes met with a shared sense of disbelief. Was it possible that this smell, warm, sweet, and comforting, was meant for them? The woman saw their hesitation. She thought of what her husband had told her before he left for the war. Keep the farm alive. Don't let bitterness turn your heart to stone. She had repeated those words to herself on many nights when they offered little comfort. Her husband was in Europe, perhaps fighting men just like these. And now, here they were in her yard, half-starved and frozen, expecting to be punished. Inside the farmhouse, her children watched through a frosted window pane. The youngest whispered, "Mama, are they bad men?" She didn't reply right away. Her gaze was fixed on one of the prisoners, a thin man with sunken cheeks who stumbled and almost fell. Another prisoner quickly caught his arm. The woman pulled her shawl tighter, a gesture that signaled both the cold and a decision she had just made. By late 1944, historical records show that America held nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war in over 500 camps across the country. Many were sent out daily to work on farms, in factories, and at sawmills. The United States War Department, following the rules of the Geneva Convention, made sure these prisoners received humane treatment. In fact, some reports indicate that German prisoners gained weight while in American custody, stunned by the amount of food available. Long conditioned to obey, remained still until the guards reluctantly motioned for them to move. As the farmhouse door swung open, a wave of warmth washed over them, carrying the impossible scent of beans and bread. It was a tide they could not resist. The prisoners shuffled forward, pausing on the steps as if bracing for a blow. Inside, a long wooden table, rough-hewn but clean, was set with a row of mismatched plates. The woman gestured for them to sit. Her children watched with wide eyes from a corner, while the guards stood stiffly by the door, their hands never far from their rifles. The men sat down slowly, their movements awkward in their heavy coats. Their hands hovered over the table, uncertain. Their eyes darted around the room, taking in the window, the stove, and the food steaming in bowls. Hunger was a sharp pain in their stomachs, but suspicion held them back. They had been taught that Americans were monsters, but here, in this simple farmhouse on a frozen December morning, a woman was placing cornbread before them, treating them not as captured enemies, but as weary travelers. One of the men was the first to act. He broke off a piece of bread, letting the butter melt into the warm crust as steam rose to his face. His eyes widened. He began to eat, his movements quick and desperate. The others watched for a second, then followed his lead. The room filled with the sounds of life being restored, the clinking of spoons against bowls, the quiet rhythm of chewing. The woman stood at the head of the table, observing. She didn't join them. She simply moved between them, making sure each plate was filled, each bowl passed around. Her face was unreadable, but her actions were a declaration louder than any sermon. The meal was not just food. It was the slow crumbling of an illusion. The prisoners ate until the bowls were scraped clean. Some lowered their heads, a flicker of shame in their eyes. Others leaned back, tears welling up. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen prairie, and the war raged an ocean away. But in this small farmhouse, for a few brief moments, enemies sat at the same table. As the last piece of bread disappeared, a single thought took farm, her table, and her decision. The prisoners ate until their stomachs ached. For men used to watery soup and coarse bread, the richness of the food was almost overwhelming. Then came the pie. Sliced unevenly, but dripping with sweetness, it nearly broke them. One man let out a short, sharp laugh, quickly stifled as he licked sugar from his fingers. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the war lifted. As the plates were emptied, a quiet calm settled over the room. They did not thank her out loud. Pride and shame were still wrestling within them. But in their eyes, disbelief was giving way to respect. The woman finally spoke, her voice even and firm. "You'll work tomorrow. Hard work. The fields don't forgive laziness." Her words were not soft, but they held a strange kind of mercy. Work meant purpose, and purpose meant survival. Her eldest son stiffened beside her, but she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your father fights so we don't lose who we are," she whispered. "Remember that." The guards signaled that the meal was over. The prisoners stood, scraped their chairs back, and filed out into the cold. Their breath rose in clouds, and their stomachs were full of food they had never imagined tasting. They vanished into the snowy darkness, leaving the boy with a heart full of confusion, caught between anger and a strange sense of wonder. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither side had anticipated. Each morning, the prisoners marched from their camp to the farm, their boots crunching on the snow-packed ground. They worked in silence at first, their hands raw as they pulled sugar beets from the frozen earth and stacked wood against the barn. The guards watched them closely, rifles ready, but the need for force seemed to fade with each passing day. The promise of a warm meal became an unspoken contract. The woman moved among them with a steady, quiet presence. She gave instructions in a clipped voice that was neither cruel nor soft. When a prisoner struggled to milk a cow, she showed him how to lean against the animal without startling it. She demonstrated the proper way to swing an axe. She offered no lectures, only practical guidance. The farm demanded work, but an obligation. This woman seemed to live by that conviction. One afternoon, a prisoner named Carl stumbled, spilling a crate of feed across the snow. The guard barked at him to clean it up. Before the man could kneel, the woman strode across the yard. Without a word, she crouched and began scooping the frozen grain back into the broken crate with her bare hands. The other prisoners stared, startled to see her dirtying her hands to help one of them. It was not forgiveness, it was recognition. That night, suspicion had faded from the table. The men ate more slowly, studying her, studying the children. One of them tried his English, halting and awkward. "Good food," he said. The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. The woman gave him a short nod. By the spring of 1945, news of the shifting war filtered in. The Allies were pushing into Germany. The Reich was collapsing. An end was in sight. The prisoners felt it most keenly. Their return to a broken homeland loomed like a shadow. One evening, a young prisoner shyly produced a small wooden carving of a bird, its wings outstretched. He slid it across the table to the youngest child. The room fell silent. The guard watched, uncertain. The woman looked from the prisoner to her child and gave a single nod. The gift was accepted. But the war crept closer. Rumors of atrocities in Europe reached the farm, and some neighbors questioned her kindness. Yet when she returned to her kitchen and saw the men at her table, her doubts were silenced. War was fought on many fronts. Hers was a table. That summer, word came that the prisoners would be sent home. On their last night, the table was set one final time. The woman had traded for extra sugar to bake 2 pies. The men ate in a heavy silence, knowing each bite was a farewell. As they rose to leave, several of them paused. One bowed his head and murmured, "Danke." The eldest prisoner met the woman's gaze. "You showed," he said in broken English, "we are men, not only enemies." She did not reply. She only nodded once, her eyes steady. Decades later, historians would find that many former prisoners of war spoke more of American kitchens treated as men.